We know from our polling and that of others that anxiety levels are at record highs. Well, I don't know that there are a lot of people who feel that there is someone of sufficient stature with a desire for stability that is ready to make peace.
From the mindset of a historian, I mean, it's pretty clear. Now, remember the great saying by Mark Twain that history, it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
It's Friday and another edition of Real Polling in Real Time with Zogby. And you got a couple of Zogbies with us. Hey, Jer, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing fine. And you?
Good. And I'm John. So real polling in real time, but we're both history teachers. 24 years for me and a good solid 10 or so for you. And so I thought we'd leave the numbers aside a little bit and riff a little bit about history like we're supposed to do as good historians. And so I've been mulling over in my mind how my mother, your Siphi, was a tremendous storyteller and would regale us with so many stories, but not the least of which was what it was like in 1939, in the late 30s, the onset of World War II, and what daily life was like, what expectations were like, what worry was like, what family, especially those being sent overseas, two nephews and others in the neighborhood in Pennsylvania. And we grew up with a sense of what it must have felt like for Americans. And so I have Americans and others, obviously, throughout the world. And I have had that sense of foreboding and wonder are we in 1939 again? Are we closer to a precipice to another major war? And the anxiety level is very, very high worldwide. It is in this country as well. And so I look, and objectively speaking, regardless of who's right or who's wrong, we do have three significant expansionist powers. We have China, of course, and always the potential that while no one is looking, China attacks Taiwan. And we are pledged to defend Taiwan by treaty. You, of course, have the situation in Eastern Europe, Russia, the Soviet Union, Russia, history of being attacked and a history of ultranationalism and a desire both for defense, but also to rebuild the great Russian Empire, just as China is hell-bent on recreating the great Chinese Empire and doing that through its Silk and Belt Initiative, Silk Road and Belt Initiative, as well as a use of smart power. You have Israel, which is expansionist. And as we speak right now, its troops are beginning its major invasion on the ground in Gaza, and always the potential of a tinderbox in that region. What bothers me is that from what my mother told me and what we're experiencing now is that we had a Roosevelt, we had a Churchill, we had a sense that as awful and as horrible as things were both in the Far East as well as in Europe, and the millions of people, even tens of millions of people that died, there at least was the hope of some stability. And I don't know that we have that today. And even if we do, I don't know that there are a lot of people who feel that way, that there is someone of sufficient stature with a desire for stability that is ready to make peace. And so Eric Hobsbawm, and I'm going to end it at this point, great British historian, called the period between the two wars the age of anxiety. And we know from our polling and that of others that anxiety levels are at record highs. And the younger you get, the anxiety levels are very high. Is this 1939 all over again, or am I overstating the possibility?
No, you're not overstating that. As far as I'm concerned, you're not.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember within a year ago saying we're already in World War III. We just don't know it. When you look back and you read on history, you're reading a textbook or you're reading books, and historians are, as time moves forward after an event is concluded, the names start coming out what to call it. And then people try to explain what happened. But if you do a little mental exercise and you try to remove yourself from that, and you imagine yourself looking back on 2025 from 2035 from the mindset of a historian, I mean, it's pretty clear. Now, remember the great saying by Mark Twain that history, it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I think he was the one that said that. Others have said it too. And the other thing to keep in mind is the great debate in history. As far as I'm concerned, the great debate is time linear or is it seasonal? I don't see how it's not seasonal. We follow a calendar year with 4 seasons. If you go to 20, 50, 100 years, you're going to see cycles. And so I agree with you, if you're even stating it, but I would say that we are in something like a major global conflict. It's not hard to imagine why. I mean, the conclusion of World War I, the seeds were already sown for World War II. And, if you go to the conclusion of World War II, it was at Yalta, which is in Ukraine. And the major powers were Russia and the United States. And I feel like we've come full circle, that those seeds were planted in 1945, and they've been sprouting. Now, what is driving it? Now, I do have to make a couple comments, and I'm not, chastising you or anything, but I do find it very interesting or peculiar, and this is very much a part of your generation. So many people in your age group still refer to Russia interchangeably as the Soviet Union. I don't think that's even the case. The other interesting thing I noticed is that you listed countries that are expansionist, and I don't think you would disagree with me, but the mother of all expansionist countries is the United States. There is no country that has waged wars, toppled governments, and sown seeds of chaos more than this country. It's a horrible, unfortunate thing, but the neoconservative ideology likes to project what I just described onto other people. That it's the Chinese, it's the Russians, and look, I operate from the standpoint that if you're a politician, or you're a billionaire politician, or you're a multimillionaire politician, 9.7 or 8 or 9 times out of 10, you're probably vastly corrupt. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it gives the United States any moral high ground to say that it's all Putin. I mean, I demonstrated this in the last podcast about the Rand Corporation's paper, which was the playbook. If you go to the Rand Corporation's paper extending and overbalancing Russia, and you look at the key section on providing lethal aid in Ukraine. Now, the Rand Corporation isn't going to come out and call it how it is, but if you read between the lines on that, what they're saying is that let's us, the United States, provide lethal aid to Kiev towards who? For what? The lethal aid is for Kiev to attack the eastern part of Russia. Why is the United States engaging and weaponizing Kiev to attack ethnic Russians in East Ukraine? That's a very basic question. Just ask yourself why that is. There's only one reason: to overextend and unbalance Russia, to draw them into a conflict, and then have the media say that, oh, look, it's the big bad Russian bear, when in all actuality, Russia was on the defense. One other thing I'm going to say is, and I saw this when I lived in the Czech Republic, the United States and the neocons were really starting to dig their claws into the Czech Republic when I was there. And there was a historic conference called the Bucharest Summit. And on day one in Bucharest, Romania, the United States and EU members and aspiring EU members met. And what was on the agenda? Bring Ukraine into NATO and into the European Union. They were talking about this back in 2008, after already bringing in over a dozen nations into NATO, which broke the promise that HW made not 1 inch into the former Soviet territory. They broke the promise under HW, Clinton, and then Bush. And here was Putin in 2008. He shows up on day 2, and he says, Ukraine is the red line. You will not go and take Ukraine and bring it into NATO. He said, he warned people 17 years ago, this is where I will draw the line. So we forget that. So the Russian bear has been poked, but as you pointed out, you've got Taiwan. I won't get into that. But, naturally the Chinese wants to expand its sphere of influence in the South China Sea. I don't really find that too surprising. But as you pointed out, then there's Israel. And I am convinced that Israel is going to launch another attack probably this fall. I don't think that what we saw in June was just a one and done. I think both sides are getting ready, and that one I don't think is going to look anything like the last. I think the other one was a test run. So the last thing I'll say, all of this coincides with the Japanese bond market collapsing, the U.S. bond market up in a tizzy, a massive bubble. Sam Altman of OpenAI said that AI is in a bubble. The Dow Jones is at 44,000. Wars seem to coincide with economic contractions. Look at World War II, the crash of 29 into 32, a world depression. That was the beginning of World War II. Look at World War I. There were panics, financial panics leading up to World War I. It also coincides with militarization, with the debasement of currencies. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that the masters of the universe profit off of these wars and, basically see the opportunity for a new kind of order. And I don't like that, but that's unfortunately the way it is. And so the second, the real actual last thing I'll say is, there's a reason that I don't get my information from journalists on this stuff, because journalists have become ideologues. I prefer to get my information about geopolitics from investors, because investors, their skin in the game is financial. So they're more likely to be objective. And somebody like Martin Armstrong, whose central bankers around the world tap his intelligence, he built a computer model called Socrates. And he's saying that his computer model is saying that there's 100% guarantee that there's going to be a global war, I think, within a year.
Okay. You didn't just help me. I'm one of those anxiety-ridden Americans. You know, among the things that troubles me, and I sort of hinted at it in the beginning, is that strenuous efforts were made to create a global order. You know, a United Nations, a Bretton Woods, Geneva Protocols, rules of engagement, and the International Criminal Court. Obviously, these are flawed. I mean, the United Nations, the Security Council, there's veto power, and the veto power is exercised by the major powers, more notably the United States than any of the other powers. The United States is not a part, does not recognize, nor does Israel, the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court. We never joined. You mentioned rules of engagement. The problem is there are no workable rules of engagement. If there were, then Putin would be on trial as a war criminal. Netanyahu would be on trial, and his generals as war criminals, and we'd be able to resolve these sorts of things, in a global fashion. But these are we've talked so many times over the 5 years, almost 6 years now, that we've been doing this podcast about the crumbling of those institutions that are supposed to promise us safety and security. And this is what we mean. They're not fulfilling a sense of safety and security. And that's a broader context for what I mentioned earlier, the lack of, statesmen and women who can step in and rally global public opinion or large chunks of public opinion. I mean, for God's sakes, you have the Prime Minister of Israel, who one of his motivations for aggressiveness and in keeping his coalition is that he stays out of prison for being a common alleged criminal. You have a president of the United States who has been convicted and who's of several crimes and civil actions and has been fined and has courts seemingly in his pocket now. We just had one ruling on fraud against him that was overturned by an appeals court. In other words, the mechanisms that we relied on for the last 75 or 80 years don't work. And that's particularly troubling. So if we feel that we're in 1939, and I think we both have that ominous sense, what steps in to stop it? And that's what bothers the hell out of me.
Well, there is hope, right? But before I get there, I have to be honest. I'm a little bit troubled by, and look, we're not turning this into hostility. I think we're demonstrating for our listeners how you and I can talk about these very important issues that are going to have an impact on billions of people. But I'm troubled that of course you and I agree Netanyahu is a war criminal. Mm-hmm. But how is there this selective memory that all of a sudden one day Ukraine just became a war that Russia attacked, when we know that the United States has been providing lethal aid to Zelensky, even before Zelensky, to bomb the eastern provinces of their own country, and the United States were providing the weaponry? Why wouldn't Zelensky be a war criminal? Why is he a hero?
There's got to be a reckoning there. I don't disagree with you. I guess there's a limitation on how many war criminals I can list in a short podcast. He's not a good guy.
He's a
He's not a
terrible
good guy.
He's a
No.
terrible, terrible person. And he's a clown. He's an absolute, he was a comedian before. Just look at some of the acts that he used to, do before live audiences on television. I mean, he was very shameless. But anyway, that's not the point. The other thing is like, there are any number of modern U.S. presidents that also could be war criminals. But here's the hope, okay? Because I want to get to that. I remember in 2013, you remember when Putin wrote an op-ed to the New York Times because Obama drew this red line over Syria?
Yes.
And the United States meddling in Syria has been very bad. That's also been a very big problem. And that was directed at Russia, but that's another discussion. But if you take my word for it that the United States were not good guys in aiding the so-called moderate rebels, just think of the Orwellian terminology, moderate rebels. I mean, that's laughable. Anyway, they were terrorists and they were tied to Al-Qaeda. But that was to knock out Bashar al-Assad, which was to checkmate Russia, who that was Russia's, ally in the Middle East. But anyway, Putin saw this happening, and that was, further offense towards Russia. And Putin wrote this op-ed, and we were like 1 minute before midnight to go to war with Russia, and all of a sudden, I thought it was a miracle. People got on their phones and they started calling their congressmen and their congresswomen, and they started calling their senators, and they said, "Stop it. Do not draw a red line. Do not engage in another war." And the war went away. And the same thing could happen. It's like John Lennon. War is over if you want it to be. Put down the Instagram, put down the Twitter, put down Facebook. Start calling your congressmen and women. Tell them to stop providing lethal aid to Israel, to Ukraine, and let's not poke the bears. Let's figure out how we can trick, because China, although it may be on the precipice of taking Taiwan, that's none of our business. But Russia isn't building military bases all over the world. The United States is 170 military bases. So anyway, if we want to really stop it, enough people call their congressmen and women and say, "We'll vote you out," and things will change real fast.
One brief comment. There was nobody to support in Syria. As bad as Bashar al-Assad was, there was nobody. There was no Charles de Gaulle waiting in the wings, to step in and stabilize Syria. And that was a real mistake on the part of President Obama to draw a red. In fact, I cringed when he drew a red line in the sand. What were we going to do to stabilize that situation? I'm going to let you then have the last word about this. Good discussion. And you and I will talk in 5 minutes, but we'll talk together next week.
I don't have anything other to say than to get the word out, especially because we gave an action item. But this was a deep dive into historical data, and this shows you, I think a lot of people know the relevance of history, but this was a real deep dive into historical data to show how it still lives with us at this moment. And I like the fact that we, talked about what could be done and why it just doesn't have to be doom and gloom. There actually could be something done, as I demonstrated. So share the word. Share the word about this particular episode. And I think that only good can come from that.
Take care.
Have a good weekend.
You too.